We have with us Professor Binod Khadria. He is former professor of economics and education and chairperson of Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies within Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is the co-editor of the latest World Migration Report 2020 and Sage Handbook of International Migration published recently. Actually, if I start talking about Professor Khadria, I have to go on and on and on. So now I will invite Professor Khadria. Sir, if you can throw some light on in which direction this crisis, which actually began with COVID, but has now expanded to engulf the world, the worldwide movement of people. So in which direction it is heading to, and what will be the future strategies to deal and govern with migration? Who will be the new stakeholders? And is it really going to seal the borders, internal as well as external, after the crisis?
Thank you. Thank you, Amba. It's always a pleasure to be amongst friends and also new friends. This is certainly heartening to begin with the rendition of the guitar, which the thoughts that came to my mind were that this is in fact saluting the COVID warriors. And now I can also add that it's also in compassion with the migrants who have been going through the miseries of the COVID-19 fallout. I must begin by thanking GRFDT for organizing this important panel discussion. And I call it important for two particular reasons. One, of course, is that in my long association with migration studies, rarely have I come across a discourse which is focused on the migrants and their families. Despite being the most important stakeholder, they remain marginalized by blinding focus blinding lights of the focus on other two stakeholders. One is, of course, the country of origin in terms of what are the gains and losses, and the country of destination, and sometimes also nowadays country of transit. But I do not see much of a focus on the most important stakeholder, the migrant. And I think it took a pandemic to make a shift in that focus, if at all. So I think that is one reason that I think this particular panel discussion is so important from the point of view of changing the focus. The second reason that Amba has already mentioned in a way, but I may just add to say, is the span of the country-specific cases that have been selected. If I may say, it begins with sunrise in Fiji and a sunset in Trinidad and Tobago and Argentina on the west. So, and between them, they cover the entire people of the world. Today, precariously affected by the life-threatening pandemic of COVID-19. Having said this, I'm conscious of the time limit and also the hitch that it got slightly delayed. I would try to be very brief. Let me come to the country case of India. I know there is another distinguished panelist from India, so my task would become a little easier. So I would like to share some mention, I'd not say sharing, but mention some broad and data, not of the COVID-19 in terms of the number of cases, the number of recoveries, the number of deaths, and so on, but immigrants and migrants, the two main focal points of this panel discussion. Now, not only is the discourse focus dim on the migrants, I know that you are all aware that it is a big challenge of data in migration studies. And this is where it's a weak point in research in migration. So I would say that in case of immigrants or international migration, only broad data are available. And in case of migrants, which I associate to be internal migrants, they are, vastly outdated. We are still, handling data of 2001 census and 2011, even 2011 data are not entirely available. So broadly, Amba had mentioned that I had the occasion of being associated with the World Migration Report 2020. Also, the UN data puts the world stock of migrants, international migrants, at 272 million in 2019, and that comes to just 3.5% of the world population. Now, this is a well-known data, has been quoted many times, cited. What is not cited is what is the size of the immigrants in India. That's just 5 million, and which comes to about not even 1%. It's 0.5 or 0.4%. So that I think we need to take into account. But Indian migrants abroad or Indian immigrants abroad, if I need to distinguish from internal migrants, that is about 10 to 12% of the world migrants. And a rough estimate, and Dr. Didar Singh would bear out because he was at that time with the ministry. The rough estimates have been now raised to 25 to 30 million Indian migrants. UN puts it at 17.5, but I think the UN takes into account only the Indian passport holders, whereas there are OCI holders who have given up Indian citizenship and become the naturalized citizens of the countries of residence. So we need to take this into account. This 25 to 30 million is barely 2% of India's population. And India's population is now being said 1.3 billion, which in terms of million, if we call it 1 million, then 1,370 million. And out of that, if we need to compare, what is the size of the internal migrants? That's huge. That's huge. We don't talk about it, but it's huge. It's 139 million are the internal migrants. That's huge. So we ask these questions, migrants, borders. Amba had mentioned about borders, but I think this COVID has brought into limelight a new angle in terms of revisiting these questions. We need to ask these questions again. Who is a migrant? Who is a migrant? Now, census definition, CSRD people and GRFDT people, they all know that this is basically at the time of enumeration. If that is not your place of birth, then you are a migrant. International migration, if you are away, you are in a particular place for more than a year, then other than your place of birth, you are a migrant. But I think there is another question that needs to be put in terms of asking as to who or what are the migrant origins. And I was curious about it, and I was trying to think about it, and I thought that if we ask ourselves, what is my migrant origin? So probably I would like to go back 3 generations backwards in terms of going to my parents, grandparents, and probably great-grandparents. And on the other hand, I would like to ask how many of the youth, of the present youth, would become the would-be migrants. We talk of Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and then in this globalized world, they are likely to move abroad. And that's why we need to probably go down into the future in terms of potential migrants. And again, I would say perhaps our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So that forward and backward linkage, if we take, we get 7 generations. And that's why perhaps 7 generation is something which is referred also in many cultures, in Indian culture and so on. So I think that is what needed to be taken into account. If we take that into account, these numbers are not only 3.5% of the world population, they are going to be much, much larger. Let me not speculate on that. And let me come to the second question that also needs to be asked again, is the question of what is a border. Now, we used to think that the border is the external boundary of countries, and this was relevant only in the case of international migration, which would determine, call them immigrants and so on. But COVID-19 has compelled us to bring the border inside countries, inside between states, between cities, between villages, between districts, blocks, and so on. So I think this is an ongoing question that we need to try to understand and answer. That, I think, is a new definition of what is a border. So I would like to say what is new in terms of migration or migrant origin or borders is that until now, we were thinking that migration is basically monitored and controlled from countries of destination. So it is the entry which is being controlled. But now I see that it is also exit from countries that is being controlled. And that, I think, is a new norm or new normal that is going to be with us for some time. Internal migrants have faced barriers in their mobility to go back home and leading to miseries, fatalities. And you are by now very familiar with the kind of images that we have come across. And in this context, we find that an Epidemic Diseases Act of 100 and some 23 years old, 1897 Act has been amended by presidential order to protect the doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers who we call the COVID-19 warriors. That's very important because there have been mass attacks on these people who are trying to carry out tests as well as enforce the social distancing to save lives. So that is important. But at the same time, if we widen our horizon, we find that there are so many other stakeholders who have also faced problems. And that for that, we have not provided any framework of a safeguard. That is what we need to think about. Those who are going to exit places out. Am I audible now? Less stressful. That is very important. So that, I think, is something we need to take into account very much. I would like to say that when it comes to immigrants, from migrants to immigrants, then what is likely to come back into the picture is great deal of selectivity. Who can migrate and who cannot migrate, who can come in and who can exit. That, I think, is going to be the order of the day. And this is where I would like to cite the US presidential executive order of suspending all green card applications for 60 days, excepting, there is an exception. That exception is very important. That exception is for the health workers, for the doctors, nurses, and other health workers who are considered to be extremely important for the purpose of fighting the COVID-19. And that, I think, is an indication of the direction in which the new normal would move for immigrants. So the long-term implications of this is going to be the health workers would be at the front, but it would not be only health workers. And I think it would rather be the whole range of STEM professionals and STEM students. And STEM, as you all know, is the frontier now of education, of training, of professionalism, and so on. STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, which is also covering the health services and so on. So, in fact, I think that there is going to be a re-emergence of what was called brain drain. That, I think, it had got to the background in the new century by the new terminology of being called brain gain and so on. We can have a different panel on that subject.
Sir, yes. You can wrap up, please.
Yeah.
Time is over.
Yes, yeah. I will take another 5 seconds. So what I'm going to say that we need to perhaps take that into account, make these STEM people or health workers who are globally in short supply to be available to the entire world. And that, I think, the way out for them is to declare them as global commons, as the 6th global common. I leave you with that curiosity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. That was really interesting. In fact, in such a short time, you really managed to give a complete picture of how things are going to and what are the issues in future that we have to deal with.